Okay, so we were talking about Kandinsky last class, and we were looking at his move toward abstraction. We were doing that by looking at first at some of the woodcuts. I'm the woodcuts. Woodcuts that he had done that derived from or related to his painted compositions. And what we saw was that from around 1907 through 1912, 1913, Kandinsky is making progress toward abandoning representation, abandoning depictions of the real world, but it's not a unified march in that direction. It's not a singular attempt, because what we see with Kandinsky is he keeps going back to the world and extracting things from it that become part of this abstract vocabulary. So the one on the left is significantly more abstract than the one in the Phillips collection. At the same time, it's earlier, because here he's gone out and made some observations, right? And he's bringing those back in. So we had just started to talk about what this might all mean to Kandinsky when we ran out of time. This is all happening at the same time he's writing and publishing. So we already saw the book called Sounds, which is exactly the same time, right, and has many of the motifs that are representational and abstract in them. And he's also writing probably the single most famous book concerning the spiritual in art, which is published in 1912, but obviously is not written overnight, right? These are ideas he's developing over these years as he's figuring out exactly what painting really means to him. So we were talking about what we see here, and we definitely have the sense that not only do we have a lake that we can make out with reflections, probably alpine peaks in the background, a bit of blue sky poking through hedges along the side of the river, but at the same time, there are numerous areas where the color is disjointed from any kind of representation. You might argue that the brownish bit could easily be vegetation, but what do we do with this big swatch of blue and its reflection in the water down below, right? What do we do with these disembodied colors in the upper right corner surrounded by whites? This one making the right angle reminded me kind of that figure rising up, sitting up in some of the other compositions that we'd seen, but it's in an opposite direction here. So what do we do with all these things? Well, as I mentioned, he's writing this book called Concerning the Spiritual in Art, and in this book, he talks about color. He talks about the importance of color for composition in very specific terms, right? Really as specific as anybody up to this point. And one of the things that he says is that colors should not be used by a painter based on description, right? Based on observation. And that's pretty much in line with what Matisse had been doing, right? Kirchner, others before him, right? So there's nothing new in that. But what he does is he talks about the fact that the way that the painter ought to use color is in a way that is sensitive to how those colors affect our soul. And he uses sort of, I don't want to say hippy-dippy terms for this, right? Like spiritual vibrations, that the colors cause a spiritual vibration. And when he's writing the book, he talks about where the colors can be seen in nature, and it's usually based on where they're seen in nature that causes the vibration. So blue is, for him, the most heavenly color, and it makes sense because it's the sky, right? He also says that green is the most restful color, and that makes sense because it's grass, you know? So there's some connection to the real world in his spiritual vibrations that he talks about, right? Just as with his paintings, even as they become entirely abstract or increasingly abstract, there still seems to be some hold on a connection to the natural world, regardless of what we're looking at, right? So what does he say? He says yellow is earthly and simple, but at the same time it's stimulating. And I think he's thinking of sort of how sunlight falls on the ground, right? It's earthly, it's simple, but at the same time it's the stimulation, right? But he also goes on and says that it's the color of madness, yellow is, right? Blue, which he mentions is the opposite of yellow in a lot of different ways, is heavenly and profound, right? Also the color of rest and of grief, things we might associate with blue, right? Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, right? The great blues record, right? Green, you mix the two together, you get green, right? The most restful color. You take madness, right, and heaven, put them together, and you get repose. You get perfect harmony, right? With green, the most restful color in existence. Passivity, he says, with green, right? Green's opposite. If green is restful, then red, its opposite, what's that? Restlessness, right? It's the opposite of restful. And then you start to mix these things together, right? Orange, red with yellow, is a more human restlessness, right? So each of the colors is associated with these different ideas. Purple, violet, is red removed from humanity because it's more heavenly, right? Basically, the book spends about half of the text talking about these different colors. White are temporary interruptions, black are permanent interruptions, right? And he maps this all out. And in his analogy, as he's writing about these colors, he talks a lot about music. For each one of them, he says, not only does it take up these particular spiritual associations, but that each of them can be connected to a particular kind of music, right? These spiritual vibrations. By calling them that, he makes it sound like a musical instrument, right? A guitar makes sound because the strings vibrate, as does the wood of a guitar. Horns make sound because things are vibrating, right? So he connects these things to music. He says yellow is the sound of a shrill horn. That blue is the sound of a cello. Let me finish this, I'll get you, okay, Lena? Right? Green is the sound of a violin. Red, because it goes from pink to deep red, can be anything from small bells, if it's a deep red, to a trumpet, if it's a light horn, or light red, right? He sees these direct connections between colors and music. And that's something we saw before with some other artists with synchromism. When we were looking at the Orpheus, we talked about that American, Stanford McDonald White, who came up with this idea that the 12 colors on the color wheel are synonymous with the 12 tones on the musical scale. And the artist's job was to compose visual music, right? So Kandinsky has these as well, and he describes each of these colors not only insofar as how they affect our soul, but also how we can hear them, in a way. Lena.
It almost sounds like he's describing an earlier version of synesthesia.
He had synesthesia.
I knew it.
Synesthesia is a neurological disorder. Yeah, but this was up on PowerPoint. You could have looked last night. No, it's exactly right. We were absolutely sure. I mean, I don't think it had been fully diagnosed yet, but we're pretty sure the way he talks about color that this is exactly what he, I don't want to say suffered from. It's a neurological disorder where people can, and it exists in many different ways, but hearing color is one of the major ones, in the same way that tasting color, people can make those, there's synapses are messed up in a way, right? And that you end up having one sensory experience while going through another, right? So tastes can be color, right? And colors can be sounds, right? So definitely, that's pretty much the standard punctuation on Kandinsky is that he was experiencing synesthesia, right? So I'm glad I broke when I did, because otherwise you wouldn't have sounded quite so good, because I would have had that up first, and there you are, right? The other issue that we talk about when we talk about how did Kandinsky get to this idea of the independence of color from description and its associations with our spirit and with sound, is a philosophical movement that he became interested in the 1900s, right, just before 1910, called Theosophy. And this was a modern philosophy, a modern theological philosophy, and that's where they get the title from, right, theological philosophy. That was begun in the, I think it's 1870s or so, late 19th century, in upstate New York, which, if you know anything about American history, upstate New York in the late 19th century was this hotbed of wacko spiritual movements, right, all over the place. In fact, wasn't Kellogg's cereal sort of an outgrowth of one of those? I think it was. In any event. Theosophy was founded by this woman named Madame Blavatsky, and I should have brought her picture, actually. She's really funny looking. But basically, when they founded it, they said, what is Theosophy? Theosophy, they said, and this is a direct quote, it's an archaic wisdom/religion. So they don't want to talk about it to be theological per se, right? It's wisdom. Ancient wisdom, once known to every ancient civilization. So it's this idea that if we look back at primal civilizations and look back at their belief structures, that basically they're all the same. And that each one of them is giving voice to the same basic ancient wisdom religion, right? So when we talk about Judaism or Zoroastrianism, right? Ancient Egyptian sun god, Ra. These are all sort of manifestations of the same thing, a shared religion. And that idea is that humanity is one, right? It's a very humanist way of looking at things, that we are not different. We are held together, right? It basically says that all religions in the world are now offshoots of this one core wisdom religion, right? That's what Theosophy says, right? And with this idea that everything reflects one thing, comes from that one of its primary tenets of belief. And that is that there is harmony in the world. Everywhere. But we just don't see it because we're too caught up with the chaos of everyday life. And if we can get past the little things that vary from one hour to the next, or from one city to the next, or from one country to the next, one day to the next, if we get past all that, we would see, it's very Zen, doesn't it? We would find the harmony that lies beneath the chaos of the world. It's very Platonic, very much like Plato, that there is perfection out there, right? But the cacophony of this world does not allow us to see it. And this is a huge influence on Kandinsky, because what he's looking for with color and with form, as he's moving away from representation, is he's trying to say it's not the stuff of this world that's important. Harmony is not a portrait or a landscape or the elements within that landscape, even though he holds on to things. The horseman rider, for example, right? Holds on to these things. That's not where the harmony lies. The harmony lies in what's beneath the surface. It's sort of a metaphysical idea that's behind that. And he thinks his job as an artist is to strip away the direct associations to this world and instead help us to find the harmony that's back there somewhere. And if not us, at least himself. That his art is this place where he can go, and there he sees, instead of the mountains in the town of Murnau outside of Munich, he sees this, finds this. Instead of a sea battle, he finds this. Now, you can still recognize the sea battle. You can see masts and sails and explosions in the water. Can you make that out okay? Right? Knowing that subtitle to the picture. And the fact that he chooses a sea battle, I think, is kind of an important thing for him. That if he's going to try to demonstrate that behind the chaos of everyday life there is some harmony, then what good does it do to choose a harmonious scene to begin with? Why not choose the most chaotic scene you possibly can and find the harmony there? Can't you prove your point a little bit better that way? So even though it might be a soldier on horseback, right? The knight that we saw in so many of his pictures, or a cavalcade of stampeding horses, or a sea battle, right? Behind it, there's harmony. Behind it, there's something that you can find that will lead you to this metaphysical state, right? And this comes out of his study of theosophy. James, did you have your hand up? Did I ignore you, or was that just a stretch? Okay, you're silhouetted against the whiteboard, so you can't get away with anything back there, right? So again, this is so important. And when he talks about the sea battle, he actually wrote about it, and he said that this is not meant to represent any specific war. He's not making a reference to the world around him. In fact, he's doing exactly the opposite. He's saying that we should be looking past that. He says, this is a representation of the struggle that's going on in the spiritual atmosphere. And for him, that struggle is the struggle to find harmony, the struggle to find peace. And so he looks past these images of violence. And there he finds instead the harmony that can be achieved through this very deliberate use of color based on these spiritual resonances, right, vibrations that he has. Now this is heavy stuff, right? This is kind of hefty lifting, right? But do you get it? The bottom line is, right, that after, and maybe you don't see how it works out here, but the ideas are there. And I think with Kandinsky, I'll tell you another story about when I was an undergrad. When I was an undergrad, I couldn't care less about modern art. I thought they were a bunch of snake oil salesmen taking us for a ride. Anybody can do that. They're just going to fill it up with poppycock jargon. But I think anymore, obviously don't think that anymore. I grew up. But I became to understand sort of when you read Kandinsky, you start to look at his pictures, you start to see things in the way that he sees them. And you start to understand that on a certain level, if you're trying to, as an artist, trying to reach a state of enlightenment with your art, then there's only so far you can go in the real world. And that once you start to delve into pictures that don't represent, I used to think it was chicken. Easy peasy. But in fact, it's exactly the opposite. Because what's really easy in the long run is representation. People go, ooh, pretty, it's a doggy. Like my least favorite painting in the world, that stupid boating party in the Phillips collection by Renoir. People love it because they want to be sitting by the side of the Seine with Renoir's pals, and they like it because of its representational elements. Strip that away, and what do you got left? Is it that good of a picture? It's certainly much harder to get a picture that works without representation. Because all you're left with is you and the paint and the canvas. And you don't get to fall back on any of those cute little tricks like, ooh, I'm going to make it look like something cute, or something nice or something pleasant, right? Representation is harder technically, but at the same time makes it easier as an artist to make works of art that might be accepted, because they don't pay attention to things like composition and color harmony. At least they don't have to. And we'll see as we look at other artists moving into abstraction, is that once you stop making pictures that represent, you better pay darned close attention to what's left. And you have to actually pay more attention to it because it's not making reference to the world around it anymore. It's only making reference to itself, right? So you don't have that opportunity to say, I don't care if it's not a really great line. It helps you understand that it's a bush. I'm looking out the window, I see a bush, right? You don't have to look out the window. There's bushes out there. You get where I'm coming with this? Right? This is really is not only difficult and challenging as viewers 100 years later, but it's also difficult and challenging for Kandinsky the artist, for anybody that decides to go this direction. It's bold and it's brave, and you're breaking every rule everybody's ever told you. At the same time, you have to focus on things that you may not have ever been able to focus on otherwise. Right? But these things simply got in the way. I've got some nice details of this. He varies the weight of the paint from thick to thin. He's obviously working it heavily because he comes back over the top of certain areas with other colors. So he lays things down, then comes back over to break up and build up the forms. At a certain point, he knows when he's done, right? When that is also itself a much more difficult choice when you are leaving representation behind. You see some of the paints just simply scrubbed in quickly, thinned down quite a bit, probably with turpentine. Other parts then building back over the top of that, around that mast in the lower left corner of the detail. You can see he's built some thicker white back up over the top. It's really deliberately painted. And that's typical for Kandinsky's work. And then we get these wonderful lines that are really non-descriptive, but end up being part of what leads your eye through the composition. Give it energy in particular sections. And then working over the top of that with these other colors. If you haven't seen it live, it's a fairly large picture. It's really worth, even my slides don't do as well as going down there and spending some time looking at this, because these are still digitized and altered in color from place to place. The other great Kandinsky painting that we have here in the DC area, at least from this early part of his career, is this, which is a fairly large sketch for another work of art. He was working out some ideas for a big work that was an homage to the city of Moscow. Remember that Kandinsky's a Russian and has moved in the early 20th century, or actually late 19th century, but during the teen aughts is in Munich in Germany. And he is now painting an image that's meant to evoke Mother Russia, right? And in particular, the city of Moscow. And he chooses Moscow simply because of all of the Russian cities, at least at that point in history, Moscow's a city. It's a big, noisy, urban place. And he's trying to paint sound. He has, as Lena mentioned quite rightly, synesthesia. Sounds and colors go hand in hand for him. And so with this particular image, a lot less white involved, a lot less scattered forms against what appears to be a ground, much more filled with elements. These are all elements meant to evoke the city of Moscow for Kandinsky, right? So this is what he says his agenda is, to paint the sounds of Moscow. And in addition to doing that, he's using elements that are derived from things that he associates with Russia. So the sounds themselves are not just necessarily sound waves, although I think we get some of that with those magenta apexes in the upper right corner. But other things are meant to associate with things that he thinks are Russia, that mean Russia to him. And one of them are the colors of the Russian flag. Russian flag is red, white, and blue, right? Just like the French flag, but kind of turned on its side, right? 3 stripes. And you'll notice running through the composition, right, from about midway at the top, diagonally toward the left, are 3 stripes of white, blue, and red. This is distillation of the Russian flag motif, applied in a non-representational way, but maintaining those colors that are associated with it. He also said that two other things that he associated with Russia are included here, but in a distilled way. One of them is, in Moscow in particular, the sleigh, ice sleigh, snow sleigh, drawn by three horses through the streets, right? Kind of, people got rid of it in lieu of Jeep Cherokee or something these days, right? You don't need it anymore. But in the 19th century and into the 20th, early 20th century, the idea of the horse-bound sleigh, especially with three horses, called a troika. We still use the term troika for any group of. I remember reading about it, like when the Miami Heat had a troika of basketball players in the front line at one year. Something drawn by three is a troika, and that's the Russian word for it. Here's a traditional 19th century troika being driven by horses on wheels now instead of on sleigh runners, right? But they function both summer and winter. And for Kandinsky, this is distilled into the upper left corner. He loves them horses anyway, right? But we now have these three lines going into these three forms here, right? So there's our troika, and it's almost as if it's drawing something from down here that maybe this is the body of the sleigh. But I think that if we try to go too far in that direction, we're violating what Kandinsky's trying to do, right? He's taking the motif and pulling it away from that so that we can think of the composition of the whole and how the different forms and colors interact with each other on our soul, not just on our eyes, right? But suffice to say that it still holds on to, even in something as abstract as this, it still holds on to a very traditional, observable reality, even as it's been distilled. The second element that he said he associated with Russia, well, third if we count the flag, is St. George, the Christian St. George. Does anybody know the legend of St. George? What did he do? How do we most often see him? Do you know this? He slayed a dragon, right? This is why we don't hear about him so much anymore, because the whole we hear about St. Christopher, but he's no longer a giant who helped ferry people across a river, right? Because that's just kind of, saints can go so far, but some things are just kind of crazy, right? Like giants and dragon slayers and things like that, right? But we're okay with the miracles and whatnot, but not when it goes a bit too far like that, right? So St. George for him is also a very important symbol for Russia. It was on the state seal of Peter the Great, right? Of St. Petersburg, right? That's who St. Peter is, Peter the Great. So he sees it as a symbol of Russian tradition. Now, and the way that we often see St. George in art is he's on a horseback with a lance, and he's kind of jousting, but he's skewering a dragon. And in so doing, he's saving a maiden. Do you see it, Lena?
Yeah.
So everybody beginning a figure on horseback using a lance to skewer a dragon. Right? That huge white, nearly horizontal diagonal going across, right? Well, here's our St. George by Raphael, which should make it really clear now, right? The lance coming across, the figure hunched over the back of yet another horse, the dragon coming back to spit fire at him, right, as he's being skewered, becomes now these figures down here in the background, right? And so here's our St. George. Presumably in this part is the horse's head, or maybe it's just right here. Blue horses will see figure in the work of another member of the group he's with in Munich, right? But this is most definitely intended to be. Now these symbols, the Troika and St. George and the flag, are simply meant to evoke Moscow, right? Russia. But really what he's trying to paint is the sound. And so if we think about those things that are inspired by the dragon's mouth in the lower left corner, those three things, we should also be thinking about things like horns, right? And the sound of trolleys screaming on its tracks, and the various sorts of sounds that we associate with an early 20th century urban environment, right? Those things are as important to him as any kind of representation. So it's not so much what he's painting as a physical object, it's what he's painting as the things that we can't see. Right? That, I think, is for Kandinsky the most important thing, and we've seen with everybody that's moving in this direction of abstract art, that what they're trying to do is to paint something you can't see. We've seen this again and again. This interest in radio, in pure light itself, obscuring physical forms like Delamay, right? The sound of that gun, obliterating the figures around it as it comes out. Right? Villon's machine shop, where you can see the sound, right? Again and again, we've seen these artists painting things they can't see with their eyes. That paint, and really, I really do believe this, that art ought to do something for us. Help us to see things we haven't seen before. Nothing else. At bare minimum, art should help us see things in a new way. But can't we take that to the limit and say maybe it helps us see things that your eye can't see? And should art? Do we also all agree that kind of art elevates our spirit on a certain level? Take that to the logical limit. And then shouldn't it take us somewhere where the cares and the concerns and the woes and the chaos of everyday life is left behind? Or at least it teaches us how to see that chaos and that noise and that cacophony and look past it and not have it bother us anymore. You know? There's something about these that I think are so profoundly hopeful and humanist. And I think that even if we're looking at somebody as jarring as Kirchner, right, from last week, what he wants you to do is to move past this world to something else, the bridge, right? That whether it's Kirchner, whether it's Kandinsky, whether it's Matisse, right? The art has a utopian spirit to it. It has this idea that it's going to help make a better here. By helping us to see the fact that the thing that seems like it's there is actually here. It's at hand. It's available, right? And one might argue, almost everybody, one might argue Picasso, finding structure, seeing solids as if they were not, seeing emptiness as if it were a solid, envisioning a world where the harmony of composition is all that matters. And I think there's this, one of the things I really like about early 20th century art is exactly this idea that, and I don't think this is limited to the arts, that each of us has the opportunity to help others understand a way forward. Right? Something out there that's better than the crap we saw in Vegas yesterday. You know? Poor Tom Petty dying of a heart attack and getting on page 5 of the news, same day as that happens. But these things that we see that just make us feel like shit. But that's the point. I had this professor in grad school, Gert Schiff. Must have stood 6'7" and weighed about 300 pounds, and just this towering, taught German expressionism. I mean, one point in class, and I was just showing slides for it. I wasn't taking art history classes in modern, but somebody asked him, well, why are all of these artists so interested in developing and building a world that's different from ours? And he was bad, Joe. Bad, sick. Bad boy. If you have been in this world for any amount of time, you realize that life is shit. Right? And I think in early 20th century, with all of this technology coming, there's the sense that you're seeing things you haven't seen before. It's gloomy. I'm not that gloomy. I don't think everything is, but I do think that there's enough that happens every week. That you could begin to say, yeah, you know what? I need somewhere else to go. Right? Maybe I make it for myself, or maybe I'll go find it somebody else. But I need somewhere else to go. I'm way off track. Right, so that's Kandinsky in a nutshell, right? And this was, like I said, only a sketch for a bigger work that's, where is this now? It's in the Guggenheim in New York. It's not often on display, but when he finally got to the finished product, he flipped it by 90 degrees, at least the framing, the painting with white border, and still kept the troika element, still kept St. George and the dragon, right? But got slightly more abstracted, and we could go into further detail. I don't quite know, but I'm sure we could find out exactly what those magenta triangles are intended to be or where they came from, right? But this is where he's headed with it, and you can see that after our sketch, he goes back to a sort of a overall composition that reminds us a bit more of your picture, Jamie, of the sea battle, where the whites become these temporary interruptions. That's what he talks about them, these temporary pauses, right? They're like in music, right? They're a rest between notes. And it becomes a little bit less oppressive that way, right? You can see the judicious use of whites and how much they affect this. Right? Now, let's see, about Kandinsky, right? When he arrived in Munich in 1896, I think it was, right? In the 1890s, he helped to gather a bunch of artists together into an artists group, which for your money, NKVM, that's all you really need. The Neue Künstlervereinigung München, right? The New Artists Group, Unification, Vereinigung, becoming one, Munich, right? The New Artists Union. Yeah, that's a good word, union, in Munich, but not in the labor sense, right? New Artists Union in Munich. 1896, he founds this group, and they're going to become sort of new artists working towards something new in Munich. Their mission was to promote modernism, new directions in art. And as Kandinsky got here, around 1911, as he begins to really challenge the traditions of representation, the group he founded kicked him out, right? He was forced to leave because they didn't like his abandonment of representation. So he goes his own direction, and he founds a new group in 1911 called the Blue Reiter, Der Blaue Reiter. And as we've seen, blue horses, horses in general, right? The Reiter in German doesn't mean only rider, it also means knight, right? Reiter is a knight. So a blue Reiter can be the blue rider, but it can also be the blue cavalier, right? That would be another word for it, right? A crusader, a knight. And these are themes that come up in Kandinsky's work a lot. So the Blue Reiter is the group that he founds on leaving the NKVM, the Neue Künstlervereinigung München. You don't have to say it, right? It's not a German. This is why they make you take German in grad school, so you can say things like the Neue Künstlervereinigung München, right? Well, they have a journal. They have a magazine that they're publishing, right? He gets another number of other quite avant-garde artists around 1910, 1911 to gather with him. The Blue Reiter Almanac, where they're publishing prints of their works, poetry, but also their artistic theories. And it's important to remember that with Kandinsky, as we're looking at this man who's really breaking new ground visually, one of the things that he's also doing is he's exploring other media. He is an artist, a visual artist first and foremost, but he is a writer of the first rank. And by the time he gets to the point where he is abandoning representation or getting close to it, he's already written at least 2 books, one of them an illustrated book of poetry, right? And he's publishing a monthly journal, or maybe it's a quarterly journal, right? That he's helping to write and illustrate as well. So the man is incredibly prolific, right? Which should be for us all an example to try to follow, right? We can all do a bit more than we do. Even I still feel that way, right? So he's at the center of a group in Munich. He's not just out there by himself as he's getting these new ideas. And one of the artists that was a member of the Blue Rider is Alexei Jelensky, right? This is a tiny picture, right? It's only about, when I was just back on Friday at the NJ, it's about like yay, right? Maybe 12 inches across. He came to Munich from Russia about the same time as Kandinsky, 1896, so it's the same year. The two of them are part of the NKVM, and the two of them break off. And Kandinsky follows Kandinsky into the Blue Rider group. The colors that he chooses are very Kandinsky-esque. And in fact, early Kandinsky's, I should have one next to this, traffic in this blue mountain motif. Painted somewhat differently than this. But again, colors chosen everywhere not for their representational value, but for their spiritual content. And Jelensky's working alongside Kandinsky at the same time that Kandinsky's coming up with these ideas about spiritual resonances, spiritual vibrations. Right? Now, both of them, I think, are looking back at the Fauves. By 1911, 1910, when these are painted, the Fauves have come and gone. Right? The Expressionists in Dresden under Kirchner, the Bridge Group, the Brucke, have come and gone. Right? And if we look at the mountains and the cloud behind it, and even some of those hot, superheated colors in the foreground, one would not be totally off base by thinking about Matisse or thinking about Kirchner and a sort of cross-pollinization there. But the agenda is totally different, right? For Kirchner, it's meant to be a swift kick in the teeth so that you wake up, right? So that you recognize the savagery that's still there. Right? Kandinsky's group couldn't be any more different, right? They want you to, and this is where it becomes complicated, right? They're doing almost exactly the same thing, but toward a different end, which is to look past representation to that utopia that's here, right? Kirchner wants us to look back. Right? Kandinsky, Jelensky, they want us to look outward, above ourselves, right? Now, this town of Murnau is exactly the same place that Kandinsky paints in autumn, or very nearby. That's this little town toward the Bavarian Alps from Munich, so it's in the countryside outside Munich. And let's see, I'm going to show you two more and then we'll quit. Another Jelensky from the National Gallery, a fairly recent acquisition. A woman in a hat where you can see the colors are, she looks kind of spooky in a way, doesn't she? Sort of some vampire-like about this, but without being threatening, because she's so cute. And a little moon face and all, right? And the big wide eyes. But look at that hat, right? And that cloak. And the colors all chosen not for representational value, and not necessarily like Matisse for intrinsic color harmonies, but again, a sonorous picture, a picture full of sound, if you will, the different colors ringing out from the canvas. But if you wanted more proof that that the Blue Rider group was in fact looking back at Matisse and the Fauves, this is a really nice comparison, right? The one on the left is in San Francisco, so we haven't seen her before. But you can see the color choices in each of them is chosen with an attempt to divorce itself from representation. But for Matisse, it's about those areas of how the green plays against the pink on her cheek, that little bit of green in the background, right? The colors in the background all meant to be this armchair that Matisse writes about all the time. Or he wrote about it once, I talk about it all the time, right? Jelensky, on the other hand, is aligning himself with Kandinsky's theories about color as sound, about color as music, about color as a spiritual resonance within us. Well, we're almost done with the Blue Rider. I've got one major artist left to do. We have to do him. And so we'll jump ahead to that and then move on. Our next group up is Piet Mondrian and De Stijl, right, is coming up next. So we'll be doing that on Friday for sure, okay? And wrapping up with Franz Marc, the last of our really major painters in the Blue Rider group, okay?